atualmente trabalha na Georgia Tech, em Atlanta, nos Estados Unidos, que é um pesquisador e autor conhecido de todos que trabalham com medievalismo, imagino. E ele vai apresentar para a gente uma breve fala intitulada Medievalismo é um vírus. E depois nós abriremos para o debate. So, doing it all again in English now. I was not supposed to host this session. That would be for Professor Vinicius Dreja, since he could not make it in time, and we hope he will get here as soon as possible. I will not do his opening talk because, well, that's his talk. I will, however, welcome everyone to our first session in our first International Medievalism Conference titled Global Medievalisms, organized by GEM, which is the study group for medieval history from the State University of Montes Claros in Brazil. And with us here today, we have Professor Richard Utz, currently at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, United States. And, well, I think he is a well-known author and researcher in the field of medievalism, so you should all be already familiar with his work in some capacity. And he will today present to us a brief keynote titled Medievalism is a Virus, and afterwards we will open the room for a debate. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. Well, Richard, with you now. And we are live on YouTube. I will send the link.
Okay, thank you so much for your kind introduction, Luis. I want to start out by thanking the entire group of organizers and just say how happy and thrilled I am to be here with you this morning. Well, morning for many of us, not those in other time zones, but that's one of the pleasures of global medievalism, I guess. I will start with an apology. I do not speak Brazilian. I don't even speak Spanish. And so I will give my paper in English. I can answer questions in English, in French, and in German if anybody wants to pose them and feels more comfortable in those languages. And Luis, who is really, an absolute whiz and so fast with everything, I've asked him to turn closed captioning on for my presentation. So if you go to the bottom of your screen in Zoom, you can actually see closed captioning. You can turn it on, which gives you a visual of what I will be saying in addition to the auditory impressions that you're getting. And of course, this is also important for those who are hard of hearing and want to follow this. So thank you very much. Medievalism is a virus, and I'll do the usual here by turning on my screen share. I hope everybody can see it. And we're gonna start here. All right, medievalism is a virus. For anyone who engages more than tangentially with the Middle Ages, and for any of those, like myself, whose career and academic work depends on the cultural significance of the Middle Ages, the past 2 decades have been downright demoralizing. The moment at which the largely negative reputation of the medieval past became self-evident is different in different geographies. For Northern Europe, that moment may have been July 2011, when the blonde, self-proclaimed anti-Islamic crusader knight by the name of Anders Behring Breivik murdered 93 people. For North America, it may have been August 2017, when alt-right, neo-Confederates, neo-fascists, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and right-wing militias co-opted medievalist symbols and slogans for their violent Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In Brazil, the advent of the Bolsonaro government in January of 2019 shocked observers with its reactionary revisionism, in which Brazil is presented as the highest achievement of a white, patriarchal, and Christian medieval Portugal. And a more generalized list of similar neo-medievalist tendencies could continue with examples from Viktor Orban's Hungary and Vladimir Putin's Russia, and France's, Germany's, and other countries' right-wing movements, all eager to anchor and legitimize their ideologies and policies by connecting with imagined features of a medieval past. If you agree with me on the continued widespread impact of medievalism as a powerful cultural phenomenon, and if you feel like I do that medievalisms, that is, neo-medievalist imaginings of the Middle Ages are too much with us, it's only a small step toward thinking of medievalism as some kind of virus, a cultural condition or sickness of sorts that can infect and impact, sometimes with life-threatening outcomes, the mentalities and behaviors of individuals, social groups, regions, nations, and the entire world. Is my comparison between medievalism and a virus only a simplistic analogy, come about because viruses is all anyone can think of right now? Please take a look at medievalist aspects of our public responses to COVID-19, and you will be reminded of the immediate omnipresence of the medieval even in 2021. I hope you will accompany me on this analogy over the next 30 minutes or so to see if it might yield some connections, some observations. If medievalism is indeed a dangerous cultural condition or illness, we need to learn what caused it, what makes it come back, even when it appears inactive for a while. And what are the conditions in which it spreads? And shouldn't we already have reached herd immunity to medievalism right now? Can we develop a vaccine? And how can we avoid the next outbreak? Who caused medievalism? Following a centuries-long academic fact-finding mission, thousands of medievalists and cultural historians agree. Ironically, the origins of medievalism can be traced back to a bunch of scholars who tried to create as unattractive a reputation for what they defined as a middle age as possible, the Renaissance humanists. Francis Petrarch and the Renaissance humanists needed a terminus post quem, a darker past against which the light of their conscious rebirth of and excellence beyond classical antiquity could shine all the more brightly. To facilitate their task, they conflated a thousand years of history into a concept of what constituted middle. And because scholarly authorities have incredible longevity, this concept of the Middle Ages is still dominant today. The Reformation, in part enabled by the Renaissance humanists' critique, vituperated one specific aspect of medieval culture, the medieval church and scholasticism, thus creating a second imposture of an era that never really was. The reformers were victims of their own success, as the Catholic Church mounted a vigorous defense, often with wars and violence, of their allegedly medieval traditions, one that brought about the increased adoration of saints, the Order of the Society of Jesus, and Baroque architecture. The close association of medieval and Catholicism was born. Pre-modern government structures remained intact. Building on the Renaissance humanists and the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment launched a wholesale attack not only against religious obscurantism, but also pre-modern forms of government. Science, capitalism, and industrialization help complete the composite image of the Middle Age as modern humanity's childhood or eternal other that would soon be overcome. As previously, there was a resurgence of medievalism, a counter-reaction from a melange of romanticism and nationalism, which created a virulent yearning to return to an allegedly idyllic pre-modern world. This desire expressed itself, for example, in everything neo-Gothic, from architecture through literature. And it brought about, in a country whose cultural and political elite saw themselves indebted to and legitimized by numerous continuing medieval traditions, England, Britain, the first uses of the term medievalism as a vague description of everything anyone might associate with the medieval past. David Matthews has written about this most ostentatious outbreak of medievalism and offered ample evidence that medievalism became a major and pervasive cultural force in the 19th century, in arts, in politics, and many other areas. In other countries, this resurgence was linked to a conservative form of Catholicism, which claimed to return to its medieval foundations. Towards the end of the 19th century, Matthews shows how English medievalism transmuted into something he calls residual, something culturally marginal, as if a form of saturation or herd immunity had been reached. Matthews also indicates how this new marginal position made it, ironically, omnipresent in a myriad of relatively insignificant remnants, citations, hints to the medieval past. The virus of medievalism seemed to have become part of the general cultural makeup of many societies. This absorption of, or acculturation to the now widespread medievalism happened because most 19th century nations began mass education of their citizens. And a final race for colonies all over the globe ensued, with conflicts that would end up leading to 2 world wars. It is at this point that medievalist scholars once again play an important role in keeping medievalism alive. Many scholars felt attracted to romantic notions of medievalism and nationalism and strove to anchor their current national territories and countries to medieval origins, persons, linguistically, politically, and culturally, thus affirming their national uniqueness, if not superiority, of their home country's cultural heritage. In fact, I will say here and now that most of us in our various disciplines, especially in medieval studies, would not exist, or would at least not have come to be as important as we have, had it not been for the national and nationalist academic arms race that took place between many countries. Governments and politicians saw the preservation and distribution of historical texts and artifacts as a priority. And even such science-like endeavors as positivist philology, diplomatics, or archival studies were in fact part of national strategies to be first, to lead the parade, and to outdo the enemy. As late as World War I, soldiers were sent to their deaths after their officers read them inspiring sections from pre-modern epics and plays while they were waiting in their trenches. As the engagement with the medieval past moved from enthusiasts, dilettantes, and antiquarians to university-educated specialists, the new professional class of medievalists, our own predecessors, needed to make sure their work was as scientific as that of their colleagues in engineering, biology, chemistry, and medicine. The discipline of medieval studies began to self-quarantine between the 1870s and the 1920s by separating the study of medieval literature from the writing of poetry, quarantining a scientific art history by splitting off images from the material milieu on the manuscript page, and auto-vaccinated against the viral danger of presentism by ending the study of constitutional history at around 1700. Hence, medieval studies became the study of the real Middle Ages, the healthy other of medievalism. The epistemological foundation for postulating this hard-edged alterity was the modern concept of time and movement, which created an ever-increasing and accelerating distance between modern scholars and their pre-modern subjects. The larger the distance, the better the scholar's ability to describe an otherwise elusive medieval reality, they said. Under all circumstances, real scholars would avoid an evaluation of the past according to the values, standards, ambitions, and anxieties of their own present. A professional curfew was imposed to keep the Victorian whim of medievalism separate from serious academic scholarship. However, since it came about in the Renaissance, the virus had found a way to overcome those containment issues and measures. For one example, it invaded the most popular narrative genre, fantasy, which at the latest, since the 1960s and 70s, developed a deep affinity with the Middle Ages, one of a simplistic view of the medieval world as a long age of faith and magic. And even science fiction, the second most popular genre in literature, increasingly began to construct alternative medieval features at around the same time. Do fantasy and science fiction unite in their medievalism because, as Arthur C. Clarke once stated, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? In the academy, following in the footsteps of reception studies, feminism, and women's studies, medievalism studies spread in the late 1970s, and by now has practitioners and adherents in nearly every part of the world. A Google search limited to pages published or recently updated just over the last month yields the following results. Oops. There's the publication notice of Studies in Medievalism, volume 30, an obvious expected candidate. There is an article about fantastic faculty, and this is about Michael Evans, who will be hosting the 36th International Conference in Medievalism in November. However, there's also a new book series with the Medieval Institute. It's called New Queer Medievalisms. There is an announcement of a conference in classical studies on Greek mythology and modern culture, a conference that tackles issues on nationalism in classical studies and thinks they're similar to those in medievalism studies. There is a conference at Central European universities on medievalism on the screen, on Tolkien sessions at the International Medieval Congress in Leeds, and then an article in Time magazine, so really big time distribution, on the America First Caucus, and it's linking itself to Anglo-Saxon history. So again, this is only just a few examples. It's clear to me that many more of us now have been infected with a non-life-threatening version of medievalism called medievalism studies. The addition of studies, and this is what comes out in that Google search, inoculates us from being called unacademic when researching the reception of medievalia in post-medieval times, including omnipresent popular medievalia. For the 21st century, Andrew Elliott has called these kinds of medievalism banal medievalisms, the endlessly repeated popular bricolage and ideological redeployments of medievalist tropes or memes, unconscious sites of unchallenged heritage and ultimately unchallenged reference points in a problematic collective medievalist imagination. Even if many of us work hard at combating these dangerous variants of the medievalism virus in books and articles and via our teaching, do we cherish the illusion that we can change how the Middle Ages has been imagined, especially since the 19th and 20th centuries? Isn't our own mother discipline, medieval studies, and much of its own history co-responsible for and complicit with the spreading of these viral stories and images? And not only in the countries and regions in which the virus originated, that is Europe, but in all the other areas, either directly or indirectly, culturally, economically, colonized by European countries. Consider, just for a moment, the following names of international outlaw figures who have been referred to as their country's Robin Hoods. There's Gauchito Gil in Argentina, Si Pitung in Indonesia, Shindahanes in Germany, Joaquin Murrieta in Mexico, Water Margin in China, Juraj Janosik in Slovakia, Ishikawa Goemon in Japan, Thierry Lafronde in France, Jesus Malverde in Mexico, Kose Verapan in India, Stenka Razin in Russia. So infectious is the virus of European medievalism, spread first by colonialism and imperialism, and then by global capitalism, that a fictional character, please think this through with me, that a fictional character whose legend originated somewhere in the English countryside could become the main global referent for all outlaws who behave even remotely similarly, even if these outlaws are situated in completely different climate zones and time zones and cultures, wielding machine guns, pistols, and knives instead of a longbow, and prospering in hideouts that bear no resemblance to a Greenwood. And of course, what have we academics done with this? We have founded Robin Hood Studies, which, like Arthurian Studies, boasts monographs, journals, and international associations and conferences, the institutional frameworks that allow us to have jobs and salaries. Not only multinational conglomerates and industry, not only nationalists and racists profit from the virus. Scholars of medieval studies and medievalism studies are complicit in the general spreading of medievalism too. Now, how can we extricate ourselves from a viral infection that at this point seems to live in an indissoluble symbiosis with its host and keeps the host just alive enough to continue its own lifespan and infectivity? How can we rid ourselves of a cultural virus when our immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic link is to think in terms of knights and plate armor? Hundreds of years after knights and plate armor no longer offer any advantage in real life. Once again, some of us have picked up the gauntlet as public intellectuals to expose the most egregious historical fallacies and abuses of the Middle Ages. But for every 25-page scholarly essay, read, as some scholars have ascertained, by an average of 12 other colleagues worldwide, a Braveheart movie, a Fox newscast, or a well-constructed meme on Twitter can reach hundreds of thousands, even millions of readers, ready to dredge up some more catchy imagined medieval past. And some of us have done what we often do when the virus seems to have a flare-up, as when Game of Thrones, Vikings, or The Last Kingdom attracted huge audiences. We used these TV series to recruit students for our classes, hoping to convert them to our form of responsible medievalism studies once we attracted them with the promise of pre-modern sex and violence. Some of us are involved in reforming medieval studies and medievalism studies from within, decolonizing areas of specialty, fighting protracted battles to change one professional organization's name to avoid problematic ideological associations. But for the one International Society of Anglo-Saxonists, up here on the left-hand side, whose members resolved to change their name to the International Society of Early Medieval England. There are hundreds of other organizations at the bottom of this page. This is the British Library page, which maintains the use of Anglo-Saxons. There are hundreds of other organizations, scholars, and journalists who sustain the old term. And the synchronous existence of both terms and their associations remains confusing. Medievalists of color and many of those interested in questions of race have been joining the discussion over recent years. Many of these colleagues are attracted to medievalism, they say, because it is an area that acknowledges the constructedness of linguistic and cultural concepts like the Middle Ages and even academic disciplines, and offers numerous venues for heretofore neglected perspectives on medieval texts and artifacts. The challenge for some of these approaches, which offer a much needed de-Europeanization of scholarly perspectives on the medieval past, is that these newly globalized histories of the Middle Ages may well be imposing Eurocentric paradigms and terminologies on areas of the world that might need and want to develop their own. Not unlike the global referent Robin Hood, entrenched European referents like knighthood, chivalry, or courtly love may keep researchers from other cultures and traditions, including indigenous traditions within Europeanized countries, from developing their own epistemological ecosystems. And the synchronous existence on the web and on social media of nationalist, sexist, and racist uses of the medieval past from a myriad of dated reference books, incorrect and fallacious accounts, will render it impossible to make a clean break with the longue durée of the ever-changing chimera Petrarch and his colleagues started to create. Finally, there are some who would like to get rid of medieval studies and also medievalism studies, or at least to cancel, ostracize, or defenestrate those unwilling to change the field at their desired speed. If you kill the host, doesn't the virus die with it? And since viruses do not have their own metabolism and require a host cell to make new products, you see what I mean? I will not advocate for this radical solution, and not only because it would eliminate my own field of specialty, my profession, and my livelihood. I will not advocate for this solution because this is the place where my analogy between viruses and medievalism must finally and inevitably fail. Unlike the small infectious agent that can only replicate inside the cells of another organism, the cultural toxin of medievalism can survive and infect via the cultural products and practices of human beings, but even in the absence of those human beings. Medievalism is enshrined in statues, monuments, religious rites and festivities, in art, in music and language, and most of all, in centuries of stories, imagery, expressions, misogynies, and all the other elements of cultural and collective memory that withstand new policies, new technologies, and innovative academic research programs. Even the young and highly future-oriented discipline of astrobiology, which seeks to understand life as an emerging phenomenon in the universe, includes much maligned medieval cosmology and faith in their deliberations about world building, accepting that they might just be as reliable for their theoretical models as modern worldviews, which have their own inherent contradictions. Implicated and self-interested as I am in the history and development of medieval studies and medievalism studies, I'm not positioned to provide you with hard and fast recommendations and solutions. I am still convinced that my academic teaching and scholarship, especially public scholarship, can make some difference. Just not the big difference I thought I could make 20 years ago. What I do know is that my own various degrees of exposure to the virus still entice me to enjoy, despite all the damage some malignant medievalisms may do, the incredible cultural complexity of specific moments of medievalism. Due to the work of Cord Whitaker and others, we have known for a while that emancipated Black Americans after the US Civil War included jousting and other medievalist pastimes and endeavors among their newly won freedoms. I will take you back in history a little bit farther. It seems that at some moment before the US Civil War, a group of young Southern men gathered to play their favorite medievalist pastime on horseback, including running or lancing at the ring, a reenactment of the kind of training medieval knights and squires needed to succeed at jousting and then fighting. While engaging in this pastime, it is reported that a young Native American all of a sudden entered their training grounds, targeted and picked up the suspended rings with his lance, and then quickly galloped away. This moment, for which I still need to verify the actual newspaper article reporting it, may represent one of the very few moments during which we can witness the moment of contact between an indigenous person and medievalism. The white Southern men were probably middle or upper class, and they engaged in a sports-like ritual that reinforced their own value system, which they believed a medievalist pastime would do. Based on this and other cavalier pastimes, Southern military leaders and politicians would later overestimate the advantage Southern cavalry units would have over their Northern counterparts. The young Native American unwittingly disrupted, as well as participated in this medievalist ritual, recognizing perhaps only its general purpose as a form of masculine equestrian agility training. I wonder if the white jousters found the disruption at all a challenge to what they believed to be their unique cultural heritage, their mastery of jousting. And I wonder if the Native American man took this experience home with him and adapted it somehow to his own purposes, as so many indigenous populations did with various European practices they encountered. Ironically, in this ritual, he participated, he disrupted, and he participated in this ritual while sitting on a horse, perhaps even a Mustang that would have been the descendant of the horses brought to the Americas by European colonizers since the early 16th century. An animal whose arrival on the continent completely transformed the lives of Native Americans in the Great Plains, and an animal whose ownership and use so impacted European medieval culture that most of its languages based their occupational names for a knight on their symbiotic relationship with the animal: caballero, cavaliere, chevalier, reta, and so on and so forth. I rest my case for now. Thank you very much for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Richard. It was an amazing presentation as always. So now we can open it. Professor Vinicius is here, I think, so I should return moderation to him. Vinicius?
I can see him wielding a sword, but he's not moving right now.
Yeah.
We're live?
Yep. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Richard, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation. It was enlightening again. You know. And it's a great pleasure to have you here to this beautiful conference, to your beautiful speech. And I have to thank all of our attendants. It will be a great event. However, thinking about your presentation, we all have contaminated, we are all contaminated with medievalism. And to most of us, it's mutualist contamination. Well, medievalism can be positive, can have positive effects. You know? And we have to combat the negative ones. How can we make this difference of contaminations and preserve the good relation, and if possible, eliminate the worst effects?
Okay, Vinicius, thank you so much. It gives me an opportunity to thank you for, obviously your role in organizing the conference. The conference we're participating in today and over the next few days is exactly one of the right recipes. I think that if the negative sides of global medievalism are everywhere and are visible everywhere and palpable everywhere, we need to organize, we need to get united, we need to exchange in order to understand that some of the things that are going on in Brazil are intimately related to some of the things that might be going on in Australia, or might be going on in Japan, or might be going on in Germany, and certainly in the US. And we need to understand that those who abuse medievalism, from Vladimir Putin to former President Trump, actually all were in touch and use the same kind of language, use the same kind of strategies in order to bolster their governments and their policies. So I absolutely believe. It's not that I've given up hope. I feel often, Vinicius, I often feel overwhelmed when I look at any topic and I realize that there are, 500, tweets against an idea, that I support, or maybe 5,000 or 5 million. It's not that we as medievalists can change everything, but it's absolutely true that we can change things in our own world, in our own area of expertise. I still would suggest that we become much more publicly active, especially those of us who have secure positions in the academy, who can afford going out there and making a strong statement and then being attacked for it. Of course, that's more difficult for students. That's more difficult for younger faculty who don't have positions where they can feel they can do that. That I believe is true. I do realize, though, that this is a different world. I have almost completely abandoned. I used to write 3 or 4 research essays per year. I no longer do that. I write maybe about 1, and my other work is usually public facing. And that's my personal reaction to the situation. As I said before, I do not have that many easy answers to the issues we encounter. One of the ways we can change things is if our own students become politicians, become engineers, become, most of the students I teach here at Georgia Tech are not in my own major, are not in my area of specialty. So basically I teach to non-specialists. And the advantage I have there is that these students take what I tell them about the Middle Ages and medievalism with them in their different areas of expertise. That's as much as I can say. Again, I have not given up hope, but I also realize that we're not yet organized enough to work together on these issues. Again, this conference is absolutely fantastic. It's not happening in the US. It's also not happening somewhere in Europe. It's happening in South America. Well, it's happening globally, but it comes to us from South America. And I think that is hugely important because there is this, and I'm part of this. I'm implicit in this and complicit with it. There is this notion that medievalism studies is either something European or that it is something North American. And it should not be, and it cannot be.
Indeed. Well, we're vaccinating them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was sort of an interesting thought experiment, Vinicius, to see, you know, how far this would take me, you know, until I came to that point where I said, you know, now it doesn't carry forward anymore, and it is only an analogy. But I wanted to think it through that way because sometimes it feels like something nasty, small, almost invisible. Remember what some of the research says, that it's now everywhere. There's a book in German which is called Überall ist Mittelalter. The Middle Ages is everywhere. Now, it was written by a medievalist, and we have a tendency to think that the Middle Ages is everywhere. But it is true that once you look for it, right, you can find it. I mean, have you thought about the fact that we're only 30 generations away from our medieval forebears? That is nothing when it comes to cultural memory. Most of our last names actually came about in the Middle Ages. We're not called Louis computer scientists, we're called Louis Guerra, right? The reason is that last names came about when the population grew in the late Middle Ages, and that's where, you know, the directional names and their occupational names, and that's what we have. We carry this medievalism forward with us, willy-nilly, sometimes unconsciously, and our job is to make it more conscious and more obvious. By the way, we have people who work with us on this in classical studies. They encounter the very same issues, the very same questions. That's a field that is asking,
indeed,
you know, about, okay, what can we do in order to be of this century, and at the same time do justice to our. Okay. There's some traffic going on. Or was that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Anyway, I'm sure there are other questions.
Okay. So, Vinicius, do you do the moderation, or should I finish it?
You could finish it.
Okay, because your connection seems to be a bit choppy today.
Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately.
So. Now for everyone on the chat and on YouTube as well, if you do have any questions, you can type in, and you can also speak yourself. Just type, I have a question, and I will give you permission to speak. Or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom as well, which way you prefer. We'll give priority to questions in Zoom and then to YouTube. We do have one raised hand already. So, Carol, you can speak. Just a second, I'm going to repeat this in Portuguese. Então, a todos, lembrando que agora estamos abertos a perguntas. Vocês podem deixar sua pergunta no chat, ou falar no chat que tem uma pergunta, se você estiver na sala do Zoom, e eu então passo a palavra, e você pode perguntar você mesmo. Um adendo, se você quiser fazer sua pergunta em espanhol ou português, você pode escrever ou falar e a gente ajuda com a tradução. Muito obrigado.
So can I ask my question? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Professor Utz, for this thought-provoking lecture, I would say. You talked a little bit about going public, right? And this is something that I've been discussing with some colleagues on the act of doing public history.
Mhm.
Do you have any kind of thoughts on how to reach a broader public? Because it's been our perception that we still talk to our peers in a way. It's a broader group, especially now that we are online. And we do reach more people, but it seems that we continuously reach, for example, undergraduate students or other historians. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how to actually go beyond? Because, for example, this conference, it's great, it's a great step, but we are among friends in the sense that we are here with people who already consider it important and necessary to think about the place.
Okay, did we lose her?
I think we did.
Okay, maybe I should wait with answering.
Carol, are you there? Think you have disconnected on us. Oh, she's
Okay.
there.
Yes, she's here. She can hear us. Okay, great. Thank you for that question. This is very difficult. Obviously, yes, we have there are institutes for public history. They're specialists in public history now, and a lot of historians are publishing. There are new blogs almost every day. There are new publications. But you're right, we're preaching to the choir. We are in a way continuing a conversation to a broader audience, but it is still a mostly academic and mostly an educated audience, that is a university educated audience. I'm not sure that's going to be very easy to change unless we teach those who connect with other groups and connect with those who are connected with broader audiences. Almost every academic conference now in Europe that I have been at has two different kinds of plenaries. One is of the plenary for the insiders, the medievalists, and then quite often they have a sort of a public lecture, which is actually what the university gets money for, because they're supposed to reach a broader public. So that is one way of doing it. But who will come to that lecture? Well, maybe the local school teachers, maybe those who are fascinated by the Middle Ages in all kinds of ways. I have two ideas that come to mind. They're not wonderful, and they're not a solution for the question you're asking, because that's going to be an ongoing battle. I call it a battle. I don't like to use words of war, but it really feels like one. One of them is we can meet our audiences where they are. I've tried that under a pseudonym in social media. And what I have experienced is such that I'm not sure I will repeat the experience. Putting out knowledge, right? Debunking myths that are out there, and then being attacked. And it was pretty much impossible to have communication, even when I tried to not respond in kind to some of the responses I got. So I don't really recommend that. I did an experiment with my students that is similar. I asked my students in a class on medievalism for them to go out and try to debunk some myths that they had learned about in class with their own communities, right? Broader social media communities. And they responded to me that actually worked quite well. So there seems to be a difference in the receptivity or degree of reception, willingness to receive, between my going out and I guess what I was writing sounded like I was a professor, or an intellectual. It's very hard to sometimes switch one's voice. And my students going out and doing the same thing. So my students actually told me that they were quite successful at changing people's minds about certain things because they had the sources, they had the information, and their partners in that communication were willing to listen. That sometimes included their parents, their siblings, and so on and so forth. So that is one way of doing this. The other way that I have noticed colleagues do this is they become consultants to large-scale operations such as movies, such as TV series. Sometimes we get contacted, sometimes we can offer our services ourselves, and have some influence in shaping how medieval narratives are put forward. Now, can that be a large-scale enterprise? I don't know. I have a colleague who recently, I'm not going to name the person, who recently consulted with a filmmaker that's looking at a new Robin Hood adaptation. I'm not sure if we need one, but we're certainly going to have 3 or 4 over the next 5 years. There's no doubt about that. And not only was she paid quite well for her consulting, she also was able to convince the movie makers of some changes to the script, of some changes to what they were doing there. Again, these are minor steps, Carolina. I do not have a recipe to do this easily at all. Andrew Elliott, I think, is on, who's written this absolutely fantastic book about including 21st century media and memes and the power they have. And once again, that's a book that explains all of that. And still, I'm not sure what we can do to reach larger audiences and have more impact. I wish I did.
Okay, so we're going one more question from here and then one from YouTube. Now we have Angela, who raised her hand. I'm going to allow you to talk. Yep, you should be able to talk.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to talk. I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Richard, for...
Hi, Angela.
Hi. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation and unnerving and unsettling one. I'm wondering what are, and I suppose you've talked about this to some extent, but I guess there's a slightly different wrinkle here in my question, which is what our responsibility is to kind of offer to our students who will then go out and we hope spread this more broadly, and also in any kind of public-facing communications that we offer, a really global sense of both the Middle Ages as a time period to kind of debunk the myth of the kind of European supremacy, which we increasingly know is not remotely accurate about the medieval period, as well as kind of trying to produce a global medievalism the way this conference is. And of course we're speaking to the converted, of course we are. And yet all of us speak to other people. And you use that analogy of the virus, and I'm thinking about the sort of ways that language and epidemiology use the same modeling patterns.
Yeah.
What extent does our conversation, to our students, to our not students, to our colleagues, to our friends, to our families, and it helped to spread not exactly a kind of just debunking of the myths that are being offered, but an alternative, more accurate, I would like to say, notion of both the Middle Ages themselves and medievalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Yes, maybe you can, come back and because I may have a question back to you. So I really enjoy the fact that we now have a global community of medievalists, truly global community of medievalists and medievalismists to work together on these issues. I don't know how you were educated in medieval studies and sort of acculturated to the discipline. My acculturation to the discipline was in the 1980s and then the 1990s. And the rule at the time was that there was no Japanese Middle Ages. And if I say that, then I'm actually doing an injustice to the culture and history of Japan. I picked that one because at the time, I still remember when I was looking into that question, I wondered is it okay to call the samurai, right? I mean, that's the typical example, society, a medieval society. And my academic teachers and friends with more experience than I told me, no, you're doing an injustice. You're actually doing an act of cultural violence by using the term medieval on another culture, on another world, so to speak. So one thing that we do while we're expanding what we know about the medieval period, whatever and whenever we, define that to have happened, is, for example, we've learned a lot about, that the Mediterranean region was completely excluded, right? North Africa was excluded. The Middle East was excluded. And these were all areas that were directly in contact, at around the same time with similar, questions. But once we go further than that, does the comparison make sense? Is there a medieval period in South America before medievalism starts, which is the colonial influence? Can we say such a thing? So these are difficult questions for which, and this is the great thing about global medievalism discussions, for which I don't have the answers, which I can throw back at a group like this, where there are people who have been thinking about this for a while and know about this. Angela, I don't know. I mean, what's your take on using the term medieval, and then all the terminology that comes with it, which is Eurocentric, and using that and applying it elsewhere?
You and I did our medieval studies at exactly the same time, so I had pretty much the same training as I suspect which I think we've both been fighting ever since in a lot of ways. But I think that for me at least, medievalism is really more of a kind of a theoretical construct of how one works with, or how, whether it's a nation or a person or a piece of art or an artifact or a statue, operates or thinks about its past. It's a particular way of using the past, or a particular way of interrogating the past, or appropriating the past, all of those different things, but it has a kind of specific quality that began as a use of the kind of European Middle Ages, but I think we can see well outside of Europe, well outside of European culture, in the use of the past and the thinking about the past, whether it's the colonizer's past or one's own past. But I also think that, I mean, maybe the thing we have to get rid of is the term Middle Ages, although I don't know what we replace it with. But if we assume that nobody else had a Middle Ages, we assume nothing else was going on during 1,000 years of history. And because lots was going on, and because at least for most of the time, there was contact pretty much all the way around the globe. When the Vikings crossed the North Atlantic, they make contact in a full circle around the globe finally. And more in the global north than the global south, but not exclusively. There's certainly a lot of contact in Africa and India and various places, less South America. But, again, I think we don't really know what kinds of contacts are going on in the Americas, and perhaps history and archaeology will reveal some of those. But things are happening across the world during this time. And if they aren't the same, at least they're connected to each other in certain ways with what available technology was, and are valuable to talk about as the Middle Ages until we get a better term. So that's my story, yeah. And I'm sticking to it.
No, I love what you said, Angela, also because in a way it takes us back to a time that, yes, was somewhat problematic for other reasons, but there used to be something called comparative literature studies and comparative studies in general. And in the 19th century, before we all nationalized and compartmentalized, right? Before nationalism came in and told us there's an English Middle Ages and then there is a French Middle Ages. And of course there is, but that's not the only thing. And we focused so much on that, that we forgot how fascinating and how much wonderful thinking happens when we compare. And sometimes when we compare that which does not appear to be comparable, right? I mean, that is, to me, the greatest boon of medievalism studies and global medievalism studies as we are doing it, as you know, Louise d'Arsens and others have been writing about it. To me, to me also personally, that's the greatest boon, because I know I can never be and should never be an expert in, let's say, Brazilian medievalism. But speaking with Louise, when Louise came to Atlanta for the first time, you know, it pushed the door wide open for me to see a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. Some of them culturally, you know, based, linguistic based. Some of them really, when you compared them, almost having the same kinds of foundations as the ones that I was familiar with. And that's what I hope to gain with studying global medievalisms.
And I just don't feel like I can teach a medieval lit or a medievalism class without recognizing this much more global nature of the period than I was ever taught.
I haven't, you're absolutely right. What I have done in order to make, you know, virtue of necessity, I mean, I brought Louise to my class. Right now, he was at the time in Atlanta. Nowadays, we would probably do it online, although I prefer to have him here in person. But you know, the last 2 or 3 medievalism related classes I've taught, I've had at least 6 to 10 external experts coming in to help my students sort of approach, you know, a complex issue with these global perspectives that they bring. So, I mean, that helped me. I'm sure you're doing this too. That's the only way I know, other than having them read, you know, long essays, but having them have the people actually there with them, ready to go back and forth on questions. That's really helped me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela.
Okay, now, just before I move forward with the questions, I'll do a quick merchandising here, which is to promote the conference. You should all have the links for the panels and sessions. If you don't, please contact us and we'll fix it. And well, please watch any that you want. Everything should be streamed on YouTube, although the sessions from like the papers will only be streamed for people who have subscribed to the event. So those are closed sessions. And also I would like to thank Vivarium, which is another group for studies in medievalism and medieval history here in Brazil, because they have kindly allowed us to host this video on YouTube on their channel, because our channel had some issues. So please do like and subscribe to their channel as well. They do produce quality academic content. Uma pequena nota aqui em português. Queria agradecer muito ao pessoal do Vivarium que forneceu para a gente o canal para fazer essa stream no YouTube, porque o nosso canal deu problema. E então, muito obrigado a vocês. E quem puder, inscreva, dê like e tudo mais no canal deles. Conteúdo acadêmico de qualidade também. Okay, so now back to the Q&A, Richard. We have 2 questions now. They are written. We have one here and one on YouTube, and I think they are very closely, so I will try to mesh them together. So, first part of the question is, I would like to thank Professor Utz for participating and supporting our conference, and I would like to ask him about his view in what are the specific challenges for the production of studies in medievalism in Brazil or other countries for the matter. And the second part of the question, which is the YouTube question, which I think closely relates to that, which is from Professor Bruno Shoa, is the global North open to receive South Americans as palestrants and presentees about medievalism? I mean, there is to have a inverse open, so to have people from the South be legitimized as much as people from the North in medievalism studies? And those are the questions.
Okay, thank you very much for bringing those together for me. So the first one, the challenges for studies in medievalism or for medievalism studies in Brazil, in other countries, I guess. I mean, politically, it must be very difficult to do the kind of work, and especially to do it publicly. I mean, I've heard about some of the attacks that have happened to your organization, right, James, over the years. I'm not enough aware of the systemic framework within which colleagues and students work in Brazil in medievalism studies. I've seen a lot of recent publications, very high activity, very high quality essays that have popped up on my screen because my trusty Google notifies me when the term medievalismo shows up in an article. So I think there's a lot of work going on. I think one of the issues, and that relates to the second question on the global North and the acceptance of medievalism studies from the global South. I think, again, I'm going to make a very general statement. I think the people who are in charge of the discourse in any area of study are the people who dictate up to a certain degree what counts as what is recognizable and what is not. So that's a sort of a general statement I will make. That's true for biology, by the way. In 1932, a German chemist made a statement at an international conference in which he said, the language of chemistry is German. And what he was saying about that was actually not completely untrue, because a lot of very foundational work in chemistry had been done in Germany by German-speaking Austrians, Swiss, German-speaking scholars. And so at some point, if you wanted to publish and be recognized, you had to do it in German in chemistry and biology in the early 20th century. That role has been taken over by English, quite clearly, despite the attempt of other linguistic groups and their scholars. I mean, France, for example, had for some time a rule that at least a certain percentage of presentations at a conference funded by a French university had to be in French, right? They have it for radio programs. A certain number of, percentage of songs, has to be of French production in order to protect French as a language of discourse, in certain areas. I will say that theoretically, the global North is more than happy to welcome the global South, right? But because the global North uses English, anything that's not published in English is not received, because most of us, I'm saying us now there are lots of native speakers of English or German who speak Spanish, many fewer Portuguese, right? But it's a question of being received. And I know that many of you already make virtue of necessity by publishing in more than one language, right? I mean, I see very often publications that come from Brazil, Argentina, Chile, both in their languages and in English, or at least with longer English abstracts, right? So I'm going to say, and this is a criticism of myself. It's easy for me, again, to work in the three languages that I know and that I'm familiar with. I had the same issue with Russian recently when some scholars asked me about, had my publications been translated, and they had not. But for Russian scholars, it's almost impossible to be noticed and recognized unless they also publish in English, or unless they publish longer abstracts in English. What does that do in effect? It silences the scholarship that comes from those countries, which is why, I don't really feel wonderful about holding forth in English. Well, it's my first language at this point. I've been in the US for 30 years. And yes, most of you will perfectly understand me. And sometimes you will not catch maybe a little bit of irony or a specific expression, but English works for most of us, right? But that is a form of imperialism. That is a form of colonialism. And until we have artificial intelligence that simultaneously translates, everything that we say, write, and do, I think we'll have to make extra efforts, which is once again why I think that this conference is important. But, and that's how I started out, I feel inadequate in expressing myself fully and being understood fully and comprehensively by being my monolingual self right now. And saying that doesn't really change anything yet. So I can see how for especially scholars in Brazil, that must be, every now and then, some of you must just think, hey, why is nobody responding to this? Or why are only people from Brazil and or Portugal and or Spain, or other countries that understand me? Why are they the only ones? Does that create, shall I say, a scholarly discussion that is not fully global? Of course it does. This is why it's so easy for people like me to get invited to an international conference. I mean, if I invited Luis or Vinicius to a conference and they were going to speak in Portuguese, or somebody were to speak in Spanish, the reception would be much smaller. The number of people attending would be smaller, right? I mean, that's a fact. So I think what you've done for this conference, where you mixed up people in the sessions, I want to congratulate you on it. I still couldn't follow everything that people say when they present their paper in Portuguese. I could not. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't attend, or that I would, not try to figure out what they're saying. I would still attend the discussion. Is it additional work? Yes. Is it fascinating work? I mean, one of the most fascinating conversations I had with Luis was about terminology, right? And what are the terms for certain things that I know about in English or in French or in German in Portuguese? Those are the moments when we learn, why does one language pick one term? Why does one language and culture pick a different one? And do they really mean exactly the same? We come back to what I just said to Angela, comparative perspectives. This is what drove the beginnings of the modern academy, comparative perspectives. Jacob Grimm wasn't a Germanic, nationalist. Yes, he did collect German fairy tales, but really he was a comparatist. He wanted to compare the fairy tales that he found in German, with those in other languages. He didn't speak some of them. He still tried. He wanted a historical and a comparative perspective on that. I think we should try to come back to that. We're small enough a field yet where we could do it.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Now we're gonna do one question from the chat here, and then we have someone else who wants to talk and ask a question. The question from the chat is from Professor Renan Birro, and he says, Richard, thank you for your presentation. Recently, we are facing some issues and intellectual struggles with scholars who are used to study and research local and regional topics. In short, they are against the relevance of studying the Middle Ages in Brazil because of their decolonial point of view. I was wondering if you are dealing with anything similar in the United States. And also, it would be helpful if you could offer any glimpse of this debate in the other side of the Americas?
Okay. Yes. Thank you for the question. That's actually quite a tough one. If I understand the question correctly, the idea is that by studying anything medieval, one always immediately confirms the colonial aspect. Is Luis, do I understand that?
Yeah, let me try to I think the point he is asking is because there is a conception to some people that if you study anything remotely European focused, or actually remotely non-Brazilian,
Yeah.
you are automatically being colonialist.
Okay. Yeah. So let me start out by saying that I understand that perspective. I really do, because as I tried to say in my presentation, I mean, what is the solution to this virus of medievalism? Now, again, we say that medievalism has great aspects and wonderful aspects, but it is true that when you look at the overall impression that we're getting over the last 20 years or so, and maybe even earlier, it is more on the negative side, especially when it comes to politics, when it comes to conservative politics, and when it comes to traditional politics. So I understand why there might be colleagues who would say, let's just not do this at all. Is this an intellectually valid position to hold? I can't imagine it to be, because the fact that we don't study something anymore because it is abused by a certain percentage of politicians and has been abused. That's like saying, I'm no longer reading Machiavelli's Il Principe because there is an edition by Mussolini to which he wrote a foreword. Now, I can tell you that that foreword is, completely anodyne and nonsensical, but still, I'm not going to stop reading that text comparatively simply because it's been abused by others. Now, if there are aspects in that text that are problematic, I can problematize them, right? I mean, that's what I do as a scholar. I can critique them, I can question them. And that is an important thing to learn. So my position here is that, again, I understand the ideological exasperation that some colleagues may have with hearing somebody discuss the pre-Brazilian history of Brazil, that is medieval Portugal, right? In many ways. And thereby the thought is, oh, that just reinforces what some of our politicians are doing. I actually think the opposite is the case. We need to study it more. So if at all possible, and I've just told you that there are limits to this, if at all possible, to critique those positions and clarify what the Middle Ages were and were not like, as best we know.
Thank you. I would just like to make an addendum, which is, you've mentioned the history of Portugal, which is interesting because usually those same people that would criticize medieval studies and medievalism studies, they would argue for a larger role of the history of Portugal in our curriculum because it is supposedly our history. To which I would reply, well, why only the history of Portugal? Because even though Brazil was colonized by Portugal, we're not Portuguese. And it's fair to say many other countries in Africa and even in Asia and other European countries are as much as part of our formation as Portugal was. So
yes, and as Angela said, we're still to find out all the global connections that actually existed, that we have not really looked for, because we were looking for something else. We were caught in the paradigm of the European Middle Ages, and we were not open, for travelers and trade connections and intellectual connections, as we now come to find out.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we have now two questions here, which the people will ask themselves. And we have a question from YouTube, which I will read between them, just to space, because people must be tired of hearing my voice already. So let's start with, this person has used the name of their study group here, so I don't know who is it.
Yeah.
But here you go, which is the Latin UFRJ. Not sure who is using the account, but you can speak.
Olá, Luiz, me escutam, pessoal? Acho que sim. Peço desculpa por isso do logo, eu não consegui trocar em função do registro do Zoom. De repente eu consigo para as próximas sessões, eu peço desculpa, aqui é Gabriel Castanho. I'll first start in Portuguese, then I will try to make the question in English. Primeiro eu queria agradecer aos organizadores do evento, né, ao Luiz, ao Vinícius, a todos os colegas do grupo de História da Medieval do Unimontes. Saudar também todos os laboratórios, como o Luiz falou, e o pessoal está falando no YouTube, realmente é uma empreitada em grupo, e eu agradeço muito pela realização do evento e por essa colaboração de vários núcleos de estudo. Eu queria fazer uma pergunta que talvez seja um pouco fora, em paralelo à conferência, então eu vou explicar um pouquinho. Acho que alguns de vocês sabem, eu tenho algumas questões com o conceito de medievalismo, e é em torno disso que eu queria falar, associado com a questão da tradução que o professor colocou. A minha questão fundamental é na fala, e de certa maneira o termo medievalismo me parece muito abrangente, e vou perguntar para o professor se ele vê possibilidades de pensar esse termo em termos conceituais, as suas diferenças internas, né? Então, por exemplo, aquilo que os pesquisadores fazem e aquilo que os divulgadores ou que as mídias de entretenimento fazem. Se essas duas práticas não têm diferenças e não provocariam produção de conceitos diferentes dentro do medievalismo. Professor, thank you for your speak, for your lecture. My question is actually not exactly on the sender of your speak, but it's linked to. My question also is linked to the question, the discussion that you have about translations, and mainly for me, it's a question about concepts. During your speak, and usually I have some issues about medievalism, and also the translation to Portuguese, what word we could translate it. My question is, during your lecture, you speak about medievalism as a whole, even if it's conceals some difference, like the difference of the studies made by researchers and the concept as something that is circulating in medias, in films, in books, and music, and etc. Mm-hmm. So my question is, do you see differences, conceptual differences, inside the whole concept of medievalism? Do you see some tensions, conceptual tensions inside this concept? And if you do, could you speak a little bit about these differences? The difference, for example, about the medievalism for sciences, science in the sense that is linked to a methodology, and the medievalism for entertainment. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. That is, no, Gabriel just has, There's his hand up. Okay, hold on. Okay. Yes, terminologies and conceptualizations of medievalism. Let me start out by saying that one of the things that has come into use increasingly when thinking about medievalism studies is actually the use of the plural, medievalisms. That is such a simple trick, and it's actually used by a lot of disciplines who want to be more inclusive and want to make sure that when we hear a specific term, that is not exclusive of something else. So medievalisms, is probably an indicator of that need for global medievalisms. They are different, and that difference is expressed with attaching that plural ending. Then you made the sort of, your question was about different kinds of medievalism, different in who practices them, and what those differences would really be. So I guess in my speech, I wanted to hint at something that I've expressed over and over the years. I actually think that popular medievalisms, so-called popular medievalisms, that is, I don't know, people who practice reenactment of medieval arms, of medieval battles, people who create medieval products, right? Medieval meals, and so on and so forth. We tend to, as scholars, make a differentiation between ourselves and them. And as I was revisiting a little bit the history of medieval studies, and looking at medieval studies as it has itself evolved over, let's say, since the 1860s, more seriously, all the way into the present, I found a lot, and I mean a lot of ideas about the Middle Ages that are completely out of this world, that are improbable, that are ideology-based. They have lots of footnotes in order to prove that they're right and that they're academic. But that doesn't make those ideas much better than if somebody over the last 25 years has studied medieval clothing, recreated some of that clothing, and is minutious and attentive to every single detail. Or so basically, I talked about the hard-edged alterity that between 1870 and 1920 we have created between other medievalism and medieval studies. And my response here simply is, medieval studies is a form of medievalism. It's an academic form of medievalism. It reimagines, it reinterprets the Middle Ages for different new audiences. And it's situated in the academy, which means that I am getting paid to do this research, to learn more about the Middle Ages and what happened to the Middle Ages after they were supposedly over, which of course I don't believe in, because the Middle Ages are everywhere. But that's the only difference. And that difference is not necessarily one in quality. Again, there were very serious scholars in the 1950s and 60s who said, and you know some of them, remember I'm a Chaucerian. I was educated to be a specialist on late medieval English literature, and especially Geoffrey Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Crusade. There were serious scholars whose work I read and quoted, who said that pretty much every piece of medieval literature should be read as an allegory. Because allegory played a very important role, like allegory and analogy, religious analogy, played a very important role in medieval life. And therefore, every medieval text had at least two meanings, two levels of meaning, if not three or four, if you went through all the levels of allegorical explanation, right? Now, most people today don't believe that anymore. But at the time, and still, even still today, some of the things that these scholars have said are perfectly great and important, but they're not more right or wrong than some of the things that happen, for example, right now at Guédelon in France, where they're constructing a medieval castle according to medieval source texts. And there are the practitioners, they haven't taken a single course with a medievalist, right? They're the metal workers, the stonemasons, and they're learning to work the stones, and they're working to learn the wood and the metal exactly the way that would have been done in the Middle Ages. They have to experiment in order to do it. They're also using some medieval texts if they're available. They work together with a comité scientifique, right? That you know, they confer back and forth. The comité scientifique has explained very clearly that they have learned more from the practitioners and their work of rebuilding the castle than they would ever have known if they only had studied the texts. And as you know, in Guédelon, they're wearing clothes that are close to what people in the Middle Ages would have worn. They use daylight. They don't use artificial light. Basically, they're trying to create conditions that are very similar to the ones that would have existed in the Middle Ages. So, so again, I'm saying that, you know, this relates back to the question that I was asked before, you know, what can we do? One of the things we can do is to try not to artificially create barriers of communication between ourselves and those who might listen to us and read our work. There is a huge number of people who are attracted to medieval matters, right? Of all kind. And we have a chance to speak to them. If we express ourselves in terms that makes it impossible for them to hear us and to understand us, unless they want to take 5 courses in medieval studies, which of course I warmly recommend. But you know, if we want to reach that audience, what we really need to do is, and that's a hard thing to do. I'm much more comfortable writing a 15-page essay in the lingo, you know, that I have learned over the last 30 years. I can do this. I know I can do it. To me, it's actually much harder. When I prepared the speech for today, I tried not to include, because of my audience, not because you wouldn't understand me, but because I wanted to hit the largest possible audience today possible. And so I excluded some terms that I could have used. I excluded some names of scholars I could have thrown into the discussion that would have made my talk a lot more scholarly, right? Because that's what we know. We throw in our authorities. So-and-so said this, so-and-so stated that. That is really good when we speak with each other, but it's not so good when we speak with others. And I think one of the questions towards the end was about the sciences and different kinds of medievalism. We should also not overestimate our influence. Actually, medievalism as an acceptable term, more or less, is very young. There are still people who will not engage with anything that's called medievalism. They're more on the side of historians sometimes. I'm talking about North America now. They're more over on the historian side than on the literature or cultural studies side, right? Cultural studies is sort of the undisciplined that is allowed to do things that more narrowly defined, compartmentalized disciplines do not. So I think we've thrived, you know, with the concept of medievalisms. I think plural is probably much better, especially when we engage globally. But I would challenge researchers to think about any essays that they have recently published and think if they could sum up that essay in a 3-page abstract written for a general audience. It's a wonderful experience. I've never done anything that hard when I tried that the first time. That was so much harder than I thought. The other thing that came up, I think, was translation before, and I just want to say one thing about that. I am so immensely grateful. There are people who have translated short texts that I have written into Portuguese. There are people who have translated some things I've written into Turkish and into Russian. And I am so incredibly grateful for that, because although I know that everybody could read my English text and understand my English text, I think reading them in their own language or in a language closer to their own language makes a huge difference in the reception of a text. So I just want to give a shout out to translators here at this conference, Luis and others, and those who speak, in both languages so that everybody can understand it. But this is one way of getting the news about medievalism out and creating a comparative global medievalism, is to speak in more than one language and write in more than one language. Actually, I'm thinking about, for medievally speaking, to have a conversation that would go on in multiple languages at the same time. Somebody would start the conversation, somebody would come in from another language with a response, which would then be translated, the terms would be discussed. That's how we can make progress to a true comparative global medievalism.
All right, thank you, Richard. We have only 10 minutes, so I will ask a very quick chat question here, which I think should be a matter of answering with almost a yes or no. And then we have another question. There was a raised hand, which was from Vinicius, and I will give him the word shortly after. So the question here in the chat is from Gregory Oliveira. Professor, about that joust in the US you mentioned, since the late 1400s in Portugal and later in Azores and Brazil, there was some sort of similar horseback games called cavalhadas. Are they somehow related?
And here comes my cultural ignorance. I do not know, but I'd be absolutely fascinated to learn more. It's true that completely different cultures actually have developed similar games, which are part of agility training, right? Usually, of course, we know that sport is a form of violence that is culturally acceptable, and so I'd be fascinated to know more about those tournaments and who participated in it, because that was the fascinating thing about what I found here. And previously I was fascinated to see how many freed slaves, former slaves, after emancipation, actually took up jousting and some of these medievalist tournaments, clearly recognizing the cultural impact and importance it had for the rest of society, that is white US society. And since they wanted to have the same rights and privileges, they participated in those. And then I found this example of a Native American, sort of seeing this and thinking, I can do this too. I'm good with my land. And then actually sort of disrupting this celebration of white Southern masculine culture. So I'd be happy to learn more about that. If the colleague would like to send me that term, so it's part of the chat maybe, or Louis, if you can forward that to me, I'd love to know more about this. Thank you.
Okay, that will be on YouTube, Richard, so you can check on the video.
Okay.
So finally, we have a quick comment here from Felipe Augusto Ribeiro, and he's answering the question proposed by Professor Gabriel. And so I'm going to read it in Portuguese first, and then in English. And then I think we close this session. So, let's see. Então, a resposta do Felipe à questão do Gabriel. Lembro que em 2011 o professor Ronaldo Amaral, da UFMS, publicou um artigo intitulado Medievalismo no Brasil. Hoje podemos pensar que ele se trata do conceito, mas ao lê-lo descobrimos que se trata de um diagnóstico do estado da arte dos estudos medievais no Brasil. Uma análise da expansão da área, subproduto da expansão do sistema universitário brasileiro como um todo, do investimento público e do crescimento dos departamentos de história e da oferta de bolsas para os estudantes interessados em medieval. É curioso porque o texto testemunha que lá em 2011, quando o conceito ainda não havia ganhado o Brasil, o vocabulário medievalismo era tratado como sinônimo de medievalística, de estudos medievais, ou seja, o medievalismo acadêmico que fala o professor Utz. E aí um adendo meu a esse comentário do Felipe, nem precisa voltar em 2011. Se você jogar medievalismo em período acadêmico, você ainda encontra publicações, páginas de divulgação tratando desse state of the art aí dos estudos medievais. Inclusive tem uma página no Instagram, acho que da USP, que chama Medievalismos, e ela não é sobre o que a gente chama aqui de medievalismos. So now, Richard, in English, he's saying that he remembers that in 2011, a professor published a paper titled Medievalism in Brazil. And he was not talking about what we're talking right now. What he meant by medievalism was not the concept medievalism, but something like the state of the art of medieval studies.
Yeah.
So what you said about academic medievalism. And that goes to show how 2011, which is not that far ago, the concept of medievalism had not yet gained this acception here in Brazil. And yeah, that's it. And to which I add that he doesn't even need to go back to 2011, because right now, if you Google medievalismo in Google Scholar, for example, you can find recent papers talking about the state of the art of medieval historiography, for example.
And that we also have to understand that we're not going to change that. This terminological quagmire also exists in many other disciplines with many other terms. Where one area, grabbed a hold of a specific term, then it became disreputable. I gave the example today about Anglo-Saxon studies, right? And then the name change to the Society of Early Medieval England. These are the ways scholars and people outside the academy, think of the term liberal, right? What did liberal mean in the 1800s? and what does it mean? And what does it mean now? When I came to the US first, some people just said it's the L word, and that wasn't meant positively. So we don't own terms, but what we can do is we can form a group of communication within which it means something, and then we can try to convince others of that meaning. Are we going to fail with the larger public and with people who are going to continue to use it differently? No. We can try, we can convince and coax, and that's it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on my own experience, liberal in Brazil and in the US nowadays have quite different acceptions as well. So we have one more minute, so I guess we should do the closing words, not to delay lunch in this already very busy conference day. So do you have any closing words, Richard?
Obviously, I want to express my sincere gratitude, and there were questions about the global South, the global North. There were questions about inclusiveness, all of these things. To me, the history of medievalisms has always been one of open doors and inclusiveness as much as that was possible. Medievalism was a place at the Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, for example, where people who would never have been accepted at any other conference or in any other section could present something on the reception of the Middle Ages and not be slaughtered. And so this is not that long ago. This is the 80s, the 90s, and even the early 2000s. I think what you're doing with this conference is absolutely fantastic and really, really important. And please count on me to participate in the future. This is something that I will not talk about by mentioning names. I have recently, because of my connection with South American scholarship, and because some of the colleagues, Luis, who've contacted me after my earlier presentation for regime, some last year, I actually was contacted, and I'm exchanging essays back and forth. There's a lively conversation going on, and I have recently recommended 2 of these scholars to an advisory board of a series that comes out of Europe, and is mostly in English. And the colleagues looked for a moment. Okay, we don't know them. I said, well, I do. I've read some of their work, and this is kind of what we need to do. Otherwise, true scholarship is not happening. And we have to get to a point where it's not even necessary for somebody like me to do that. But we have to get to a point where people know enough of the scholarship, let's say coming out of Brazilian universities, so that it can be received and that more than I and some others know about it. Of course, lots of people know, but this is I've dedicated my scholarly career now. At this point, I can afford to do that. I don't have to be narrow, because being narrow gets you published better, because you're not experimenting that much, because you're staying within your paradigm. I would encourage, if any of you have questions about getting published in North America, about reviewing, I'm opening up, medievally speaking, to reviews in Spanish, in Portuguese, in any other languages. The great thing is I know enough people who can help me, ascertain if everything's okay. I cannot do it for all the languages, but this is an open invitation. Please take me up on it. If you want to now, but we're looking for medievalism, right? We're not looking for medieval studies more narrowly conceived, even if we think that all medieval studies is a form of medievalism. So I just want to thank you. I'm thrilled to be part of your group, to have been invited, and I look forward to listening in on some of the other sections later.
Well, thank you for the kind words, and we will surely take you up on that. Don't worry. So I would like to thank everyone who stood with us till the end. We had just a minute, my cat is harassing the computer. We had 110 people watching this presentation during the whole time, which is impressive. The numbers did not drop at any moment. So thank you very much for being here. And well, I hope to see you all on the rest of the conference. E só gostaria de agradecer a todos por terem assistido e por estarem aqui. Espero ver vocês ao longo da conferência também. And of course, thank you very much, Richard. And well, hope to see you soon. So
Thank you.
bye-bye, everyone.